The deck of the USS Hornet was 467 feet long. A fully loaded B-25 Mitchell bomber needed at least 500 feet to get airborne under normal conditions. Nobody had ever launched a plane this size from an aircraft carrier before. Nobody knew for certain that it could be done. The engineers had run the numbers and said it was theoretically possible, but theory and a pitching flight deck in heavy seas with a loaded bomber and 80 men whose lives depended on the answer are very different things. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the first plane, pushed the throttle forward, and found out. The Hornet plunged into a swell as his wheels left the deck. The nose of his B-25 dropped toward the water. For a moment, a long one, it wasn't clear whether the plane would fly or simply disappear into the Pacific. Then it climbed. 15 more planes followed him into the sky, one after another, none of them sure they would make it, all of them going anyway. Where they were going was Tokyo, and none of them had a way to get home. 4 months before that morning on the Hornet, the world had changed. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and in 2 hours destroyed or crippled 18 ships, killed more than 2,400 Americans, and shattered the myth that the Pacific Ocean was wide enough to keep the war away from the United States. What followed was catastrophe on a scale that Americans had never experienced and were not prepared to understand. Within weeks, the Philippines were falling. General MacArthur had been ordered to flee to Australia, leaving 80,000 men behind to face capture or death. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in February 1942, with 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops marching into Japanese captivity in the largest surrender in British military history. Japanese forces swept through Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. They bombed Darwin, Australia. They were approaching India. There seemed to be nothing and no one capable of stopping them. In the United States, newspaper front pages tracked the losses. Radio broadcasts brought the news into living rooms, where families sat in silence. Americans who had been told their military was powerful enough to deter any enemy now watched that military lose, retreat, and surrender across thousands of miles of ocean. President Roosevelt understood that the country needed something. Not a plan, not a press release, not a speech. Something real, a signal, a blow, proof that Japan was not invulnerable. He called in his military commanders and told them what he wanted. He wanted to bomb Tokyo. The response was almost universal. Impossible. The nearest American bases were thousands of miles away. No carrier-based aircraft had the range to reach Japan and return. No land-based bomber could get there and survive. Japan was safe, untouchable, surrounded by ocean and distance and the ruins of everything the United States had sent against it. A Navy captain named Francis Lowe wasn't so sure. Lowe was a submariner, not an aviator. He had no particular reason to be thinking about long-range bombing. But in January 1942, visiting a naval air station in Norfolk, Virginia, he watched Army Air Force's B-25s practicing landings near a runway that had been painted with the outline of a carrier deck. He stopped watching and started thinking. The B-25 Mitchell was a twin-engine medium bomber, big, heavy, not designed for carrier operations in any way. But Lowe had just seen one fly, and he had just seen a runway painted to look like a carrier deck. And he had just started asking a question that no one had thought to ask. What if a bomber didn't have to land on a carrier? What if it only had to take off? He took the idea to Admiral Ernest King. King took it to General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces. They ran the numbers. They tested 2 B-25s at sea. On February 3, 1942, both planes lifted off the deck of the Hornet and flew away without difficulty. The raid was approved the same day. The man chosen to lead it was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, universally known as Jimmy, who at 45 was one of the most accomplished aviators alive. He had set world speed records, won the first blind flying competition in history, earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, and spent most of the previous 2 decades doing things with aircraft that other pilots watched and decided not to try. He was exactly the kind of man you sent on a mission that had never been done before. He accepted immediately. Then he made one condition. He would fly the mission himself, not plan it from a desk, not watch from the carrier deck. He would be in the first plane off the Hornet, leading 79 other men through Japanese airspace and out the other side. General Arnold agreed. He also quietly told his staff that he expected Doolittle to be killed. The crews came from the 17th Bombardment Group, the most experienced B-25 unit in the American military. They were called in and offered the chance to volunteer for a mission described only as extremely hazardous. No details, no destination, no explanation of what they would be doing or what the odds were. Every man in the room raised his hand. 24 crews were selected, later reduced to 16 for the mission itself. They were told nothing more until they were already at sea, days from home, with Japan somewhere ahead of them and no possibility of turning back. They trained in secret at Eglin Field in Florida through most of March, practicing short field takeoffs over and over, getting the distance down to 300 feet, then 250, learning the specific technique that might keep a bomber alive coming off a pitching deck at sea. A Navy carrier pilot named Henry Miller came down from Pensacola to teach them how carriers worked, because none of them had ever been on one. Doolittle qualified alongside them. If he was going to ask these men to fly off a carrier, he was going to learn how to do it first. On April 1st, 1942, 16 B-25s were loaded onto the Hornet at Alameda, California. The fleet left San Francisco Bay the next day. Sailors on other vessels in the harbor looked at the planes strapped to the carrier deck and couldn't figure out what they were for. The B-25s were too big to land back on the ship, which meant the ship wasn't carrying them to use them. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to. On April 13th, the Hornet met up with the carrier USS Enterprise and her escort ships in the middle of the Pacific. The combined force turned west and accelerated toward Japan. Only then, 2 weeks after they had left California, days from their target, surrounded by nothing but ocean, did Doolittle gather all 80 men on the deck of the Hornet and tell them where they were going. He told them they would bomb Tokyo and other cities on Honshu. He told them they would fly west to China afterward and land at airfields being prepared for them, because the planes were too large to return to the carrier, and the carrier would be turning back immediately after launch. He told them the mission was dangerous and the odds were not good, and he understood completely if any man wanted to withdraw. No one did. One thing Doolittle did not say out loud: if the fuel calculations were correct, and the weather cooperated, and the Japanese didn't shoot them down, and the landing fields in China were where they were supposed to be, they might survive. If any of those conditions failed, they probably wouldn't. The men went back to their planes and waited. The original plan called for launching when the Hornet was 400 to 500 miles from the Japanese coast, in the hours before dark, so the bombers would reach Tokyo at night and have cover flying out over the Pacific toward China. At 3:10 in the morning on April 18th, American radar operators on the Enterprise detected a Japanese picket boat far outside the expected patrol range. A second one appeared. These were small vessels stationed well off the coast specifically to watch for approaching enemy forces, and at least one of them was close enough to see the American fleet. It almost certainly had a radio. Admiral Halsey had a decision to make. The task force was still 650 miles from Japan, 200 miles farther than planned, in daylight, with the element of surprise likely already gone. If he pushed forward, the carriers would be in range of Japanese land-based aircraft. If he waited, the picket boats would have more time to report. He gave the order. A signal went up to the Hornet from Halsey's flagship. Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command, good luck and God bless you. Doolittle got the message and looked at the numbers. Launching 150 miles early, in daylight, over rough seas, meant arriving over Japan in daylight, which they had specifically wanted to avoid. It also meant the fuel margin that had always been tight was now gone. There was no longer any guarantee that the planes had enough gas to reach China. He gave the order to start engines. The sea was running 8-foot swells. The Hornet was pitching into the waves. A crewman had been washed overboard during preparations and lost. Wind was blowing across the deck at 40 miles per hour, which helped with lift and also made everything more dangerous. Doolittle rolled his plane to the starting position at the far end of the deck. The bow of the ship was ahead of him. The Pacific was ahead of that. He had 467 feet of flight deck between him and the end. He watched the bow of the Hornet. He needed to launch at the precise moment the bow came up from a swell to maximize the upward momentum of the deck just as his wheels left it. The bow came up. He pushed the throttle all the way forward. All 16 planes got off the deck. Not one of them failed. In 1 hour, in rough seas, in conditions that every calculation said were marginal, 16 B-25s launched from a carrier deck that was too short in a maneuver that had never been done before and climbed into the sky over the Pacific. They flew in loose formation at 200 feet above the water, low enough to stay beneath Japanese radar, burning as little fuel as possible, the ocean close enough to see individual waves. They had no fighter escort. No one was coming to help them if something went wrong. At noon on April 18, 1942, they crossed the Japanese coastline. Japanese citizens looked up and saw American planes. Some of them waved. The rising sun markings on the wings looked similar enough from the ground, and the idea of an American bomber flying over Japan in broad daylight was so completely outside the range of possibility that many people's first instinct was that these must be Japanese aircraft. Then the bombs started falling. Doolittle's plane hit targets in northern Tokyo. The other 15 spread across the city and south to Yokosuka, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, hitting oil storage, steel mills, factories, a naval yard. Anti-aircraft guns opened up. A few Japanese fighters scrambled and gave chase. None of the B-25s were shot down or seriously damaged over Japan. They were over the Japanese homeland for approximately 30 minutes. Then they turned west and flew toward China, and the fuel gauges kept dropping, and the coast of Asia appeared in the distance as darkness fell and the weather closed in, and one by one, the planes ran out of options. 15 planes headed for China. One, running critically low on fuel, turned north and landed in the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned for over a year before escaping. The 15 heading for China faced darkness, bad weather, and fuel tanks that were past empty. The landing fields that were supposed to be ready for them weren't lit, or couldn't be found, or were in the wrong place. One by one, the crews made the decision that there was no decision left to make. They bailed out or crash-landed in the dark. 3 men died during the attempts to reach the ground. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. Of those 8, 3 were executed by firing squad. 1 died in captivity. 4 survived more than 3 years of imprisonment before the war ended. Doolittle landed in a rice paddy in China after parachuting from his plane. He sat in the mud in the dark and thought about what had just happened. Every aircraft was gone. He didn't yet know how many of his men had made it. The mission had started perfectly and ended in pieces scattered across thousands of miles of ocean and Chinese countryside. He later said he thought his military career was finished. He had lost every plane. He sat in the mud and waited for morning and prepared himself for a court-martial. Instead, when word reached Washington of what had happened, Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor. Arnold promoted him 2 full grades, skipping colonel entirely, to brigadier general in a single day. The promotion was backdated to the day of the raid. When reporters pressed Roosevelt to reveal where the planes had launched from, he smiled and said they had come from Shangri-La, the fictional paradise from James Hilton's novel that no one could find on any map. The name stuck. In 1944, the Navy commissioned a carrier and named it the Shangri-La. Roosevelt renamed his presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains Shangri-La, a name later changed by Eisenhower to Camp David. The physical damage from the Doolittle Raid was minimal. A few buildings, a few factories, 12 Japanese killed. The kind of damage that a single bombing run on any ordinary day of the war might produce. But what happened next because of those 30 minutes over Japan was not minimal. The Japanese military, humiliated that American planes had reached Tokyo, immediately changed its strategic priorities. Fighter groups that were desperately needed in the South Pacific were recalled to home defense. Japanese commanders began arguing that their defensive perimeter needed to be expanded, that they had to push further east, capture Midway Island, eliminate the threat of another raid. That decision led directly to the Battle of Midway 7 weeks later. At Midway, the Japanese Navy committed 4 of its fleet carriers to the operation. American codebreakers had deciphered enough of the plan to set a trap. In one afternoon, on June 4, 1942, American dive bombers sank all 4 of those carriers. Japan lost more experienced naval aviators in that single battle than it could replace. Its offensive capacity in the Pacific was broken. Military historians debate many things about World War II. Most of them agree on this. Without Midway, the Pacific War lasts years longer and costs hundreds of thousands more American lives. And without the Doolittle Raid, there is probably no Battle of Midway, at least not that battle at that time in those conditions. 80 men took off from a carrier deck on a mission with no way home. The bombs they dropped caused almost no meaningful physical damage, and they may have shortened the war by years. After the war, the surviving Doolittle Raiders had a tradition. Every year they gathered for a reunion. There were 80 silver goblets, one engraved with each man's name. As long as a raider was alive, his goblet stood upright. When he died, his goblet was turned upside down. Each year there were fewer upright goblets. The last formal reunion was held in 2013. 4 survivors remained, but only 3 could make the journey. Age and health had claimed the ability of the 4th to travel. They sat together at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio, and they raised their glasses and looked at the goblets that had been turned face down over the decades. They drank a bottle of cognac that had been kept for this moment, saved since 1896, the year Jimmy Doolittle was born. Doolittle himself had died in 1993 at the age of 96. He had lived long enough to see his raiders receive the Congressional Gold Medal, long enough to be called by generals who had been children when he took off from that carrier deck, long enough to understand what those 30 minutes over Tokyo had actually set in motion. The last of the 80 volunteers was Richard Cole, Doolittle's own co-pilot on the mission, the man who sat beside him in the first plane off the Hornet. Cole died in April 2019 at the age of 103. He was asked many times in his last years what he remembered about that morning. The pitching deck, the throttle, the moment the plane either flew or it didn't. He always said the same thing. He said they knew the odds weren't good. They went anyway. "We were young," he said, "and it needed to be done."